This is episode 20, and we'll be looking at classes and objects in Python. So maybe let's start by defining some terms that we'll be using in this video. So the first term that we'll be throwing around is class. So a class is just a collection of functions and attributes which are attached to a specific name or identifier. And these classes and objects, these functions and attributes are used to represent an abstract concept. Then an attribute is just a piece of data, and that is to say a variable that is associated with a class. And also the other term that we'll be throwing around in this episode is the word object. All right. So an object is just a concrete instance of a class or an entity that is generated from a class. So just to explain again the concept of a class, if you go back to the definition that we just read, we say that a class is just a collection of functions and attributes, right? And these can then be attached to a specific name, and they represent an abstract concept. So maybe let's imagine that we are trying to build a customer, right? A customer, a program that's going to store data for our customers. So in order for us to actually do that, we actually have to create something called a class, and which is basically the blueprint with which we want to explain the information or to store the information pertaining to our customers. So the abstract concept in this case is actually what? Is actually customer, right? And I want you to take note of the capital letter C right there. So in order to actually make this abstract concept a class, we just have to append or rather to prepend the class keyword, and automatically we have a class in Python, just like that. So this customer, now we actually need to go inside of the class and define a set of functions and maybe other attributes that we are going to use for this particular customer. So maybe what we can do is we can actually start by defining the init method, which is basically a constructor. So what we can do with the init method is this: we are going to pass some arguments inside of init. So by convention, or rather the Python expects that every method that you are going to define inside of a class, it should have the self parameter or the self argument, right, passed or rather defined inside of the parenthesis right there. So that's why you saw that I have self going on right there, right? Then more of self later on, but for now just stick with me. So we also want to have the name for our customer. Then we also want to have their balance, and we also want to have maybe their status, right, whether they are active or not. Then inside of here, what we can actually do is we can then say self dot name is equal to the customer's name. Then we can also self dot balance is actually going to be called the customer's balance, and self dot status is actually going to be equal to, or we are going to assign the value of what, of status. Again, I will be explaining the self keyword as we progress, once we have some concrete data that we can work with, but in the meantime just stick with me, then I'll come back and explain. Then let's also define a method that is called introduce, or maybe let's just call it display. Let's call it display info, right? And remember, we said that every function that you are going to define inside of a class is actually supposed to have what, the self keyword, right? So we have self in there, rather the self argument, not keyword, the self argument or the self parameter. Then we simply want to print self dot name. Then we also want to print self dot balance, and we also want to print self dot, what else do we have? We have status. All right, maybe then what I can do here, instead of just having the end items printed out, is I can say the customer activation status is, then we will append with whatever status would have been passed when we create that particular object. Then here we want to have name of customer, right? Then we just display the name right there. Then let's come here and say current account balance is, then we display the balance right there. All right, so I'm done defining my class. So now what I can actually do is I can then come outside of the customer class, right? Then before I actually go ahead and create an object right here, what I'm going to do is just I'm going to run through the code and explain what we just did right here. So the abstract concept that we've just that we want to represent in this case, maybe we are writing a banking program. So the abstract concept that we are trying to define or to store data about is that information that pertains to our customers, is it? So the class customer is actually going to describe what a customer is able to do, is it? So in this particular instance, we have two methods, right? Two functions, and these belong to this particular customer class. So the first method, rather every other class that you're going to define in Python is actually going to have this method called init. It's basically an initializer, right? Or a constructor, as it were. So this constructor is actually going to be called whenever you create a single concrete instance of the customer class. So when you actually create a customer, maybe let's say we are going to create a customer called Tom, right? It means that that customer is actually going to be expected that we pass in the name, the balance, and the status for that particular customer, right? And those are going to be set to whatever we would have given during object instantiation, right? So the self keyword now is actually going to refer to the object itself, right? So we are now saying that whatever you pass inside of name right here, we are going to set that as the name for that particular object, right? I think that's one way of that's one way of explaining how the self keyword works, right? It's just going to refer to the object itself, and we are saying this object's name, let's set it to whatever name has been given by what when we instantiated the object, as it were, as well as self.balance, right? We are just going to take whatever balance has been passed when you created that object and say that is the balance of that particular object. So that's what the self keyword means. Then here we have an additional function which is called display info. So this is simply going to display information that pertains to what? To our object that we would have created. So let's actually go ahead and create maybe 3 objects. So let's first have a customer code. Let's have customer 1. I'm just going to call it C1. So C1 we want to create from the customer class. So remember, we've defined the customer class, right? So we can actually create or rather instantiate. We are now instantiating the customer object, and the name of the object is actually C1, right here. That's the name of the object. Then we are now calling the customer class. But you will remember that whenever we create or we instantiate a customer from the customer class, right, we need to pass in 3 arguments. The 4th argument, remember, it's always going to be there because it's the self argument, right? So we need to pass in 3 arguments right there. So the first argument that we are going to pass is the customer's name. So maybe let's say the customer's name is Tom Cruise, and they have 450 in their account, and their status, maybe let's say it's true. So that's customer 1. Let's go ahead and create another customer, and let's create a customer code maybe let's go with Tony Stark, right? And maybe the balance is 800 and the status maybe it's false in this case, right? Then let's also have another variable, rather another object of type customer. This one, let's call this one Jason Statham, and they have, let's say, maybe 200 in their account, and their status is we can also just set it to true, right? So what we've just done in this case from that is on line 16, 17 and 18 is we've actually instantiated, or we've created concrete instances of the customer class, right? So remember, the customer class was just defining how we are going to store information about our customer, and C1, C2 and C3, they are actually they actually implement the customer class right here. And when we instantiate, or rather when we create the customer class, we are now calling the init, or the initializer method, which is basically a constructor, and we are telling that when you create the customer class, I want you to pass in these as the arguments to what, to the init method. So now init is actually going to take Tom Cruise, right, and say that this object itself, I want you to take the name and set it to the name that was passed when this constructor was called. Is it so? Your name is going to be Tom Cruise, balance is going to be 450, and true was going to be what, the status right there. So this is actually going to happen for the other two objects that we created on lines 17 and 18. Then we also have this display info method right here. It only has one argument of type self, right? So basically, in other words, this particular method doesn't take any other additional arguments, right? Because remember, self, it's by convention, it should always be there to inside of any method that you create within a class. You should always have the self method. So this one is simply going to display information that pertains to the customers, right? So maybe let's say we wanted to display information that pertains to the C1 customer, right? What we can actually do is we can just come and say C1 dot, right? And I want you to notice what's going to happen when you use the dot selector in Python. It's actually going to, since this is an object, it's actually going to look inside the class for any methods that are available to us. So most of these methods are really starting from annotations all the way up to down the list right there. Those we call the magic methods, and I think it's too early for us to be talking about them. But in the meantime, we're only interested in the display info method because we are the ones who created that one. The other ones, they come built into Python whenever you start using the object-oriented programming feature of Python, right? You automatically get those additional methods, but we'll be looking at them maybe in future tutorials. But in the meantime, we're just interested in the display info in the display info method, and we're actually just going to go ahead and run the script. So Control J to open the terminal. Then so we want to run what's the name of the script? So it's classes and objects, right? So .py, make sure I have an underscore right there. So classes and objects.py. So you immediately see that it's going to say name of customer is Tom Cruise, current account balance is 450, and the customer activation status is what is true. So that's how you can actually access methods that are, or rather functions that are inside of what, of a class. So you can actually do the same for the other two objects, right? Maybe let's just go ahead and say display info for C2, for the C2 object, and we can also display info for the what, for the C3 object. So what we can actually do in this case, we just print an empty space in between the methods, so that we have some nice formatting down there in the console. So you should see right here that we get what, starting from this point right here. Let's clear the console, then run it one more time. So you see that we get name of customer Tom Cruise, current account balance is 450, the customer activation status is what is true. Then it does this the same thing for the other two methods. So that's the whole idea behind classes and objects in Python. We'll be looking at more OOP concepts as we progress with the tutorial, but I think that's just about it for this episode. I'll see you in the next one.